We will be talking tonight about self-control. I joked with Jet earlier this morning after his class that would give me about 40 minutes to correct everything that he said about self-control in class. And then I joked even further. I thought, it's on YouTube. I could just play clips of Jet and then, disagree or whatever. But no, I agree to pretty much everything that Jet said today. I know Jet had a whole lot of notes left, so maybe I'll hit some of it tonight. But for those who have not been here, as we've gone through these character traits, we start with the definition. We've been starting with Webster's, and we'll do that again, but I was a little disappointed with Webster on this one because they only gave one really short thing, and so I went a little bit further trying to figure out this word so we could at least be on the same page as we start. So first of all, from Webster, restraint exercised over one's own impulses, emotions, or desires. Now, there is a lot to the one definition there, but restraint, I think, is probably key, at least in this side of self-control. Now, there are a lot of aspects to self-control, and we'll look at several of them tonight, but I think restraint is one of those places we normally start in our minds. When we think self-control, we think of what is the thing that you want to keep yourself from doing. That's often the way we think of it. I probably should have asked Nathan's permission before this one, but it's one of my favorites. When Nathan was a 3-year-old, he was at the Mother's Day Out thing at College Church in Searcy, Arkansas. And we came to pick him up one day. Nathan was a much more active child at 3 than he is today. And he would run around and everything. And he was in there, and the teacher in his classroom probably should have retired about 6 years earlier. But she'd been teaching that thing for a long, long time. And so when we went in, we found, just to our horror, this lady just chasing Nathan around the classroom. And every time he would kind of slow down and she'd almost get there, he would go a little faster. And I thought, this woman's going to have a heart attack chasing him around the classroom. And so, finally, Nathan! And he stopped, and we got him to go. And we're like, was it like this all day? He was okay today, but it was a little bit of a challenge today. But he'll do better tomorrow. And Nathan, 3-year-old, said, I don't think so. And we coached Nathan up quite a bit on self-control as he was a small guy, because that was one of those areas where we felt like, we need to be better about this. So restraint exercise, one of the big ones. In the International Standard Bible Encyclopedia, they went the synonym route. And so they went with control of temper, self-discipline, and temperate. And we'll see different translation of Scripture come with some of those, especially with temperate and self-discipline. And so there are that aspects of self-control. And once again, it tends to be in the thought of things that we are not going to do, not so much things that we are doing. And then third, in Baker's Illustrated Bible Dictionary, they say this: self-control involves the willingness to submit to the boundaries of nature, society, and family that God places in the world to bring about order and harmony in relationships. The self-restraint of an individual's thoughts, words, actions reflects the ordered discipline of God's creation. Discipline of the self is essential to live a productive life in community. Now, there's a lot there, but what I really appreciate about it is it's not just this thing we are to do or not do. It's part of our piece in God's creation. And so if you think all the way back to the created order of how God does things, you have chaos, and then God brings in order. And so you have all these things that are just completely out of order, and God begins to order them one by one. And for us, self-control is one of our pieces of that. We are to live lives that are controlled under the design that God has brought. So Greek words, real quick, and there's only 2 of them, so don't worry too much about this tonight, but it's worth looking at. The first one, enkrateus, is the one that you find in Galatians 5 that you're familiar with. And it's a combination of 2 words. Kind of ironic that self-control, even in the Greek, is a combination of 2 words. And you have the N, the EN at the beginning, is basically our in, I-N. And the krateus part is power. So to say self-controlled is to be in power, in control. And so if we want to think back a couple weeks, as Jet was talking about gentleness a couple weeks ago, gentleness comes from a place of strength, not a place of weakness. Self-control is the same kind of thing. It comes from a place of power, not a place of lack of power. Because to be able to control, then by the very nature of that, there must be some power there that's being controlled that you're exercising. So it is in control. And as Jet mentioned this morning, if you weren't in class, I'm sorry, restraint of one's emotions, impulses, or desires. And he mentioned it came from Acts 24 and verse 25. As he's talking with Felix, Paul's talking with Felix, it says that he reasoned about righteousness and self-control and the coming judgment. So that's one of the three places in the New Testament we find that Greek word for self-control. The other one we'll find is actually just a little later in Acts, and it is sophrosine, a little harder to say than the first one, but it is the same type of word that is sometimes translated self-control, but this is the meaning it carries according to the Greek lexicon: soundness of mind, reasonableness, and rationality. So in here we see something that it's not quite as much about what you're holding back from, which is where we tend to think, but more of a control of what is going on. And so you are sound in your thinking, you're reasonable in your thinking, you're rational in your thinking and in your actions. And we find that just a couple chapters later in Acts 26, where he's talking to Festus. Paul, talking to Festus, says, "I am not out of my mind, most excellent Festus, but I am speaking true and rational," is how it's translated here, or self-controlled words. So we'll have these two different ways it's mentioned in Greek, and some of the other verses we'll look at tonight have each of those. But self-control is a pretty major idea, even though it's only mentioned a few times in those words. So what does Scripture say about self-control? First of all, self-control is a sign of wisdom. Remember this morning in Ephesians 5, we were talking about walking as wise rather than unwise. In Proverbs chapter 29 and verse 11, it says that a fool gives full vent to his spirit, but a wise man quietly holds it back. Have you ever given full vent to your spirit? Have you ever had somebody give full vent to your spirit? If any of you work in retail, you probably have experienced that at some point along the way. I worked at a couple different retail places growing up, and I saw the bad side of people. People got irritated. Or, if retail was not enough for me, my first adult job before I got into ministry was at a health insurance company. Nobody calls their health insurance company unless they're mad about something. You don't call your health insurance company just to check in, just see how things are going, tell them they're doing a good job or something like that. They haven't paid a claim correctly, or your bill was more than you thought it would be, or something like that. And so as soon as you picked up the phone and said the name of the company, they're already mad. You haven't done anything yet, and they're already upset. And so I saw a lot of the full vent. At the same time, if I'm honest with myself, I've also given a lot of the full vent. I'm bad sometimes about reacting before I think, reacting before I realize the whole of the situation. And so the proverb writer here says, a fool gives full vent, but a wise man quietly holds it back. Self-control. And a lot of times for us, it probably begins with words. I think for most of us, if we felt like we could just get control of our words a little better than we do, we'd feel pretty good about self-control. It's a good place to start. Secondly, Christians are called to exercise self-control. This is not one of those things that is optional, or one of those things that is a gray area. It's pretty clear. We are called to be people who are self-controlled in how we live. In Titus chapter 2 and verse 11, Paul says, "For the grace of God has appeared, bringing salvation for all people, training us to renounce ungodliness and worldly passions, to live self-controlled," that was the second Greek word we looked at, by the way, self-controlled, upright, and godly lives in the present age. So part of this godly, upright kind of life is a life that's self-controlled. It is something that is a contrast to the world around us. Peter, in 2 Peter chapter 1, says this, "For this very reason, make every effort to supplement your faith with virtue, and virtue with knowledge, and knowledge with self-control." This is back to the other Greek word, the one you find in Galatians 5 with the fruit of the Spirit. And self-control with steadfastness, steadfastness with godliness, godliness with brotherly affection with love. We also find that Christians should grow in self-control. It was a week or two ago now we talked about growing, how we're not just supposed to be static in our walk with God. We should be maturing, growing. Self-control is another of those areas of growth. The next verse there in 2 Peter says that if these qualities are yours and increasing. So if you think to yourself, well, I'm about the same as self-control level that I've always been, we should be increasing in that. We should be getting better at that and all that other list of things. So we are growing in self-control. And then he says, whoever lacks these qualities, again, not optional, whoever lacks these qualities is so nearsighted that he's blind, having forgotten that he was cleansed from his former sins. So self-control is one of those evidences of us living in the way that we should be living. Next, self-control involves several things. First of all, the mind. We should be able to control how we think. Now, if words are not difficult enough for us to control, the mind's a whole nother level, isn't it? I don't know about you, but the time where I don't say the awful thing that has come into my mind, I feel like self-control, I've grabbed onto that. I want to be growing in self-control to the point that the awful thing doesn't come into my mind in the first place. That I don't think the reactionary thing, that I don't think the worst of someone. So first of all, self-control, there's part of it that is mental. Paul in 1 Corinthians 9 says, I do not run aimlessly, I do not box as one beating the air, but I discipline my body and keep it under control, lest after preaching to others, I myself should be disqualified. So it also involves the body. There's a part of self-control that is our thought. There's also a part of self-control that is our action and what we do. And we probably, our world around us, I think, probably understands this better than any. There's always folks with an exercise plan or a diet plan or some sort of regimen, or if you're an athlete, there's some kind of coaching that you follow and you do these things. We understand that, but as Christians, there's an element of that for us too, that we should be controlling how we think, what we do. In 1 Peter 1 and verse 13, Peter says, therefore preparing your minds for action, so he puts them together here. Your self-control with your mind, and that leads into self-control with your action. And being sober-minded, or self-controlled, if you want to think of it that way, set your hope fully on the grace that will be brought to you at the revelation of Jesus Christ. So what is our hope set on, if we're honest with each other? Our hope's probably set on all kinds of different things as people, as fleshly creatures. We probably think of all the things that are important to us. But Peter would say to us, just set it on the hope. Set your hope here on the grace that comes from God. The end of all things is at hand, 1 Peter chapter 4, verse 7. Therefore be self-controlled and sober-minded for the sake of your prayers. So again, self-controlled, sober-minded, all there together. Verse 8, be sober-minded, be watchful. Your adversary, the devil, prowls around like a roaring lion, seeking someone to devour. So self-control, action, watchfulness, they all kind of go together with how we are to live. Self-control also involves our words. So it's our minds, our bodies, and then the way we speak to one another. In Psalm chapter 141 and verse 3, the psalmist says, set a guard, O Lord, over my mouth. Keep watch over the door of my lips. Wouldn't it be nice sometimes if there was a door there? And you could just grab a little more control before you speak instead of thinking. Or if we want to think of it in the Proverbs way, Proverbs chapter 21 and verse 23, whoever keeps his mouth and his tongue keeps himself out of trouble. How much of the trouble you have found yourself in has been a result of the thing you have said without thinking, the thing you have said too quickly, or if we want to think in more New Testament terms, James chapter 1 and verse 19, let every person be quick to hear, slow to speak, slow to anger. So quick to hear, willing to listen, but slow to speak. And I reverse those all the time. And as a result, probably a little more quick to anger than I want to be. Self-control also involves our reactions. And I think all these other things kind of set us up for this. One of our biggest struggles for a lot of us is that we react. We react to a situation. We react to what we're assuming is going on. We react to what we have decided is in someone's hearts or in someone's mind. We react all the time. Self-control is controlling that reaction too. In Matthew 5 and verse 39, Jesus says, I say to you, do not resist the one who is evil, but if anyone slaps you on the right cheek, turn to him the other also. And if anyone would sue you and take your tunic, let him have your cloak as well. It just seems so far-fetched when you think of it in our world's terms, doesn't it? I mean, the idea that someone would come up and slap you, that you would just, okay, other side. The idea that someone would sue you and you wouldn't immediately go out and be seeking the best representation and try to prove your case and all of those things, that you would instead just not react the way that the world reacts. And I think Jesus chooses extremes here because honestly, they're probably extremes that most of us won't face. Now, for the crowd he's talking to, I would imagine the world in which they live, this is probably a little more common than it is for you and me. But for us, I can't think of the last time I was slapped across the face. I'm sure it happened somewhere along the way in life, but it's not a recent thing. Haven't been sued, probably because they know there's no point in doing that. They wouldn't gain much from it. I don't have to worry about these examples, but there are things like this all the time. Someone says that undeserved criticism to you, what do? You think of all the places where they have fallen short and how you can show them how small they are. Even with the people we care about. You get in an argument with someone within your family, and they say something to you that you feel is unfair and unjust, and how quick do we want to go back to history? How quick do we want to go back to the place that they've messed up before and remind them of that? And Jesus would say to us, self-control, a piece of that is we don't react the way the world reacts. Could you imagine a week where this is what Christians did? Could you imagine, students, could you imagine a week of high school, junior high, college, where you see somebody in class or in a hallway say something just awful to another person, and that other person just lets it go? Or responds with a, I love you. Or I know you didn't mean that, or what's going on? Why'd you say that? What if we reacted in different ways? In 1 Peter chapter 2, Peter says this, servants, be subject to your masters with all respect, not only to the good and gentle, but also to the unjust. For this is a gracious thing when mindful of God, one endures sorrows while suffering unjustly. So in suffering, we exercise self-control. When we are wronged, we exercise self-control. When things are not as they should be, we exercise self-control. And then verse 20, he says, for what credit is it if when you sin, you are beaten for it, you endure? But if when you do good and suffer for it, you endure, this is a gracious thing in the sight of God. It's different than what the world around us does. In verse 21, for to this you have been called because Christ also suffered for you, leaving you an example so that you might follow in his steps. So everything he was doing was not just to do it, was not just to accomplish the task he had been sent here to do, not just obedience to God, although all of that is part of it. There's another piece of this that is an example to us. How did Jesus react to people? And he reacted in a way that was self-controlled. And we'll look at a couple examples of that in a minute. Verse 22, he committed no sin, neither was deceit found in his mouth. When he was reviled, he did not revile in return. When he suffered, he did not threaten, but continued entrusting himself to him who judges justly. Can we do that, or do we feel like we have to take care of this? We have to get what's ours. We have to get vengeance. We have to right this, whatever it may be. Or do we trust in God enough to be self-controlled in how we react? So some biblical examples of self-control. We'll look at a few here. First of all, Daniel. In Daniel chapter 1. We won't get into the lion's den part of the story down in a later chapter, but we will look at chapter 1. It says in verse 3 that the king commanded Ashpenaz, the chief eunuch, to bring some of the people of Israel, both of the royal family and of the nobility. So Israel has been taken off into exile. They're in a place of no freedom. They don't get to do what they want to do. They don't get to go to the temple because that has been destroyed. They don't get to live the lives that God has called them to live, at least in the way they're used to doing it, but they're beginning to learn how to do that in a place where they're in exile. And so he calls these people in, youths without blemish, of good appearance and skillful in all wisdom, endowed with knowledge, understanding, learning, and competent to stand in the king's palace and to teach them the literature and language of the Chaldeans. So basically, they call in the best of the best. And they're going to teach them and kind of train them to be like the rest of them. In verse 5, it says, the king assigned them a daily portion of the food that the king ate and of the wine that he drank. They were to be educated for 3 years, and at the end of that time, they were to stand before the king. So the king brings all these guys in, and he gives them the best of the best. They're to eat this food, drink the wine, the same stuff that he has. This is the life that is set out for them. And honestly, if you were in exile, this doesn't sound so bad, does it? Eat the stuff the king eats. When I was a student at Harding, they had a big banquet area upstairs where they would serve other people the really good food. And they would have, things come in where there were donors or whatever, or some kind of big official banquet. And the next day after the banquet, you would try to get to the cafeteria early because the leftovers were there. And it was the leftovers of all the good stuff everybody else got to eat. And all the students knew. They knew they would actually try to find somebody that worked in the cafeteria and say, what was on the menu last night? And if you heard something that sounded good, you were there quick the next day because you wanted some of that before it was gone. So for Daniel, all this is laid out, but the problem is this is not the way he is supposed to eat. This is not what he is supposed to drink. as a child of God. And how many people in the same position would think, well, a child of God is also not supposed to be ripped away from his home and have his town destroyed and not be able to do all these. Where is God in all of this? And you start to rationalize through all of it. But Daniel is different. And so among these are Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah of the tribe of Judah, or as you better know, these other three guys, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And they are all together there. And in verse 8, it says that Daniel resolved. Daniel resolved that he would not defile himself with the king's food or the wine that he drank. Therefore, he asked the chief of the eunuchs to allow him not to defile himself. And throughout the rest of the chapter, there's kind of this discussion of, but this is what we've been ordered to do, and we can't disobey the king, and you're putting us in a weird position here. And Daniel basically says, well, try it and see how it goes, because the reason they're feeding us this way is so that we will be healthy and good and all of that. So try it our way, and then see who's healthier. And sure enough, they do. And they try it their way, and Daniel and all his friends are just as healthy as they can be, and the king is pleased, and everything is fine. But it begins with this resolve of Daniel. Self-control requires resolve. We have to decide within ourselves, this is how we are going to live, and this is how we are not going to live. And you'll notice, by the way, in the choice of Daniel, we tend to, with Daniel, talk a lot about the things that he does not do. But there's so much about what Daniel does do that is where the resolve comes in. He's not going to eat the king's food and drink the king's drink, but he is going to eat and drink the things that he is supposed to eat and drink. He's going to live the way that God has designed for him to live. And as a result, he's blessed. Now, it's not always perfect for Daniel. I would like to think, getting to the end of chapter 1 here, he has resolved, does the right thing, everything goes well, that everything is smooth sailing from Daniel from that point on. But most of us know the story of Daniel in the lion's den and know that's not the case. And even there, once again, Daniel shows resolve and God works to make sure that he is safe. Secondly, Jesus in Matthew chapter 4. And this is definitely a case of the things that you do not do in that side of self-control. And then we'll look at one right after this that maybe we'll be challenged a little bit by. Matthew chapter 4 and verse 1, it says that Jesus was led up by the Spirit into the wilderness to be tempted by the devil. So he's hungry. He goes out there. We'll learn in the next verse. After fasting 40 days and nights, he was hungry. And the tempter came to him and said, if you're the Son of God, command these stones to become loaves of bread. And notice something about the tempter, by the way. He knows the weak point. He knows where it is that we can be tempted. And so he knows Jesus is hungry. And so he tempts with food. If you're the Son of God, command these stones to become bread. But he answered, it is written, man shall not live by bread alone, but by every word that comes from the mouth of God. So he's tempted in this one way with food, which, can we talk about self-control and food Thanksgiving week? Is that allowed? We may have a moment of that coming on Thursday. But Jesus says, I'm going to exercise self-control here. And so he comes from another angle. Then the devil took him to the holy city and set him on the pinnacle of the temple and said to him, if you're the Son of God, throw yourself down. For it is written, he will command his angels concerning you. On their hands they will bear you up, lest you strike your foot against a stone. Okay, so if food is not going to be the thing, Jesus, show us your power or God's power, however you want to look at it. Throw yourself down, you will be rescued, everything will be fine. And Jesus said to him, again it is written, you shall not put the Lord your God to the test. And again, remember where we began with these definitions of self-control. In power. These things are not temptations to Jesus unless he can do them. And so he knows he literally can look at a mountain and turn it to bread. And it would be pretty impressive if he did it, wouldn't it? He knows he can throw himself from this high point and he'll be fine. But yet he doesn't. And so then the devil took him to a very high mountain and showed him all the kingdoms of the world and their glory. And he said to him, all these I will give you if you will fall down and worship me. Now, I have to admit to you, when I read through the temptations, when I get to this one, it's a little bit of a letdown for me because he's already given up so much to be there in the first place. This one's not new to him. If you look at Philippians 2, he doesn't consider equality with God a thing to be grasped. He's already got everything he wants. And he gives it up, takes on the form of a servant, becomes nothing, and comes here. And so the devil says, I'll give you all of this. And Jesus said to him, be gone, Satan, for it is written, you shall worship the Lord your God, and him only you shall serve. And so I will not bow down to you because I already have chosen to serve someone else. And again, when we think in terms of self-control, how many of our issues could be solved by reminding ourselves we have already chosen to serve God instead of whatever this is. We already chosen to serve God, and because of that, our reactions should be different than they are. We have already chosen to serve God, and because of that, our thought should be different than it is. The way we talk to one another should be different than everybody else around us. I've already chosen who I serve. Then the devil left him, and behold, angels came and were ministering to him. So self-control also acknowledges God's authority. I don't think we usually think of it in these terms, but that's what Jesus is doing throughout these temptations. It's not just, I'm not going to give in and do this thing. It is a reminder that God is the one that is in control, not the thing or the one who is there tempting me. And as Christians, that's a choice we made when we went in the water. God is the one who is in control. And we rise to walk in this new life where our self-control is an exercise of his authority. And now a third one, and this one, honestly, if I had said, tell me a story about Jesus and self-control, this may be the last one you have ever chosen. In John chapter 2, not the water to wine that we immediately think of in John chapter 2, but later in the chapter, Jesus cleanses the temple. Now, in the other Gospels, Jesus cleanses the temple late in the story. They're in the last week of his life. And there's a lot of debate among commentators over, did he do this twice or maybe more, times that we don't have recorded? Is this the same thing and John put it in a different spot in his gospel for some theological reason? I'm not going to get into that argument. I don't know. I think it's very possible it's two. I've seen good arguments for one. In the end, I really don't care. It just doesn't matter to me one way or the other. If that interests you, study away. But it's just not my thing. So John records the story, and his recording of the story is different than the other two, which is one of the things that lends a little credence to the idea of it's more than once. But John's story, and I think you'll notice the difference here as we go through. It says in verse 13 that the Passover of the Jews was at hand, and Jesus went up to Jerusalem. In the temple, he found those who were selling oxen and sheep and pigeons and the money changers sitting there. And usually when we think of this story, we think in terms of anger. Or maybe we think in terms of righteous indignation. When have you been upset about something that caused you to act and you wanted to do something to fix this thing or to make it better? And so in Jesus, we see kind of a defense of the times that we feel that way. Now, oftentimes, I think if we really challenge ourselves, the times we feel that way sometimes have a little bit of selfishness in them still. Sometimes it's just a little bit of, I don't think this is okay and because how it affects me. But for Jesus, it is, this is not what this place is supposed to be about. And so in verse 15, it says, making a whip out of cords, he drove them all out of the temple with sheep and oxen, and he poured the coins of the money changers and overturned their tables. Now don't miss the little detail here in John's account that you don't see in the others. He made a whip out of cords. This is not Jesus losing control in a fit of anger. This is not Jesus in a moment of weakness who has just had enough. And this is the time where he's going to lash out. He took the time to make a whip out of cords. And I don't know how long. My assumption is there are not cords right there next to the money changer's table. And so he sees that and then reaches down and it makes... I don't know if he goes back out and comes back in. I don't know if he's already got something with him as he comes in. But however he goes about it, he takes the time. And I think of the times where Jesus takes time. Isn't Jesus a pretty thoughtful person as he takes time? Think of him with a woman caught in adultery that we looked at a couple weeks back. He kneels down, he's drawing there in the sand, whatever it is he's drawing. And he takes this time where everything is just kind of coming into place around him. And so here, he doesn't just see it, red in the face, if it's a cartoon Jesus, steam coming out of his ears, go over to the tables and start flipping tables over and pushing people out. He takes the time to make this whip of cords, and then he begins to drive them out. And so there is a piece of self-control that is also active. Jesus' self-control, this is not one that is stopping him from doing something. It is causing him to do something. And it says, by the way, in the verse we just skipped by there, zeal for your house will consume me. This is what the apostles remember having heard. That zeal is a concern about something that drives you to action. And do we think of self-control in those terms? Because if it is in power, if it is strength in power that we are exercising control over, is that self-control sometimes a self-control that's not causing us to not do something, but it's instead causing us to act, causing us to do. And that's what we find Jesus doing here in John chapter 2. So I don't know where your self-control is. I don't know if you struggle with it as much as most do. I would imagine for a lot of people, this is, if they look to a regret in life, a lot of times it could root itself back in this. It could root itself in something was said and I reacted and I can't take that back, and I've had to do damage control about that for decades now. It could be I knew the right thing to do and I didn't. It could be there was some sin that I just got wrapped up in and I kept trying to get out of, and it just pulled me back in. It kept calling back out to me, and I just find myself back there over and over and over again. And maybe the self-control issue is that for you. Or maybe on the other side, it is the, are we controlling in doing? Are we controlling in acting? Are we, as we talked about this morning in class, are we allowing the Spirit to control, to cause us to move in the ways that He would have us to move? Because self-control is all of those things. It acknowledges that there's an action of some kind to be done, whether that action is an action that holds us back or an action that pushes us forward. And for us, the challenge is finding the balance in there to know which way to go. To not go to either extreme of anything, but to find the way to be the Spirit-led people that God has called us to be. Tonight, you have probably, if you don't struggle with this, it has impacted your life in some way. People around you, people you care about, who have not exercised self-control, and you have seen their lives spiral as a result, it affects people a lot. And we just look to the example of Jesus in living lives that are self-controlled and want to be more like Him. If you have never given control over to Him, you can do that tonight. You can be baptized into Him, and you can learn what it is to live a life that is controlled by the Spirit as we exercise better self-control. Or if you have allowed yourself just to do whatever it is you want. It's easier that way. You've rationalized it. Maybe it's fun sometimes. And you realize there's no hope there, as we read about earlier. There's just no hope in trying to do this on your own. God wants you to come back to Him tonight. If there's some way we can help you with that, please come while we stand and sing.